Thanks for being here today and looking forward to the conversation.
Thank you.
We're going to make this pretty casual over the next 20 minutes or so and explore a range of topics. But Joe has just an incredible background. And where you've sat, Joe, over the past decade and more, you've really had a front row seat to seeing how the Department of Defense as well as private industry have approached machine learning and AI and the challenges and opportunities associated with that. And maybe just to start off, could you share just a little bit about maybe your background as a Marine Corps officer on the intelligence side to private industry, and then also from what you've seen, looking backwards over the last decade at the department and how they've approached AI and ML?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for the introduction. I'm honored to be here today and to be on the stage. When I look at the other speakers and those in attendance, I wonder how I ended up on the stage. I am, I'll be quite frank that I'm not a technologist, right, by background. As you mentioned, my background is predominantly military. After college, I entered the Marine Corps, did several tours overseas, ended up in law school and then in industry. And I did about a decade or so on and off active duty. So my introduction to this space was not from the technology point of view. It was really from the operational and mission point of view. And the way I got involved in AI was, quite frankly, we had a problem in the department that needed AI as the solution. It wasn't that we sought to do AI. It was we were trying to do something very specific. And when we looked at the range of technologies that were useful, AI was uniquely valuable. So that's how we kind of got started down this field in 15, 16. So that's kind of my background, and then I rejoined the department in the 2016 timeframe for the to start up and help found an initiative called Project Maven. I think many people are familiar with in the computer vision space. So that was my introduction to now switching from the operational point of view to now moving into the Pentagon.
Yep.
And thinking about what it's like to create the policies, the acquisition mechanisms, the interaction with industry, the testing mechanisms. Responsible AI, those pieces associated with it. So I've been working on that on and off for most of the last 7 or 8 years.
I want to make sure that we talk about responsible and ethical AI and how the department's approaching that. But I want to get very practical, nitty gritty first. Can you talk a little bit just about on the ground experience with the building blocks of machine learning capabilities and the challenges associated with that and some of the lessons learned coming out of Project Maven, the Algorithmic Warfare Initiative, 5, 10 years ago, and how those have informed where you're making bets today?
Certainly, when we look back on the lessons from 10 years ago, I imagine anybody who's started an enterprise and looked back at it a decade later says, hey, I wish I had done everything differently. And I'm not saying we wish we'd done everything differently, but the lessons we learned were absolutely enormous. And I think largely, if you read the initial department forays into large-scale artificial intelligence implementation, which was really Project Maven. And the DoD has been in the AI space for decades. I'm not claiming that Maven was the first initiative. What it was the first initiative of significant scale and funding that was focused less on AI research and more on AI operationalization. That is taking AI technologies into the field and seeing if they can meet mission demand. And so, when you read the charter from Maven, which is available, you can read it on the open internet, it talks a lot about rapid fielding, prototyping. It's really about getting capability into the hands of the mission users to see if and how it applies to advance their individual missions and initiatives. And that was sort of the model in 16, 17. But if you track the progression of that initiative and the department's overall work in artificial intelligence and machine learning, we've really moved to sort of new optics. And so in 2022, the department stood up this organization that I work with now called the Chief Digital and AI Office. And really the focus here is less on how we quickly prototype the solutions. And then when you look at something like Maven, when you break apart its budget, you realize that the vast preponderance of the actual energy, the money, the time is spent on really foundational enablers, the environments, the compute, the data, the test frameworks, the integration frameworks, the interoperability. those components ended up taking most of the time and energy. And so the purpose of what we're doing at CDAO, where we've stopped AI as its separate thing, and now AI is integrated with the data elements of the department. So Dr. Martell, my boss, oversees both the data and the AI components of the DoD, as well as the digital services and software components, is really thinking about underlying infrastructure rather than trying to quickly and aggressively promote solutions to warfighting ends.
Yeah, I think that resonates a lot from, with this group in particular, in that there's so many conversations about data availability today. And I know, I think it was about 18 months ago when there was a policy memo that dictated that data is now a strategic asset. I forgot the exact terminology here, but it starts with data. It leads to hardware, enabling technologies, and then finally the models, kind of at the very end, right? And starting to think about that full life cycle and putting in place the conditions so that you can move prototypes to production, in months or days instead of years, right, or decades.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the words matter, and you'll notice from the department in particular over the last 3 to 4 years, there have been real movements in the space of data. A lot of it at a policy level. The words matter. And I think you're right. When you look at it, the initial memo said data is a strategic asset. The analogy was data is the new oil. I think we've all heard that.
Yep.
The thing about the Department of Defense, though, is that can sometimes be misinterpreted. And in the case of it's a strategic asset, that can be interpreted to mean, oh, this is something I need to hoard. It's something I need to silo. It's something I need to protect.
Yep.
We've tried to change the vernacular around data over the last year or so, and you'll see some new department data and AI strategies coming out where we really are trying to embrace the value of data as a product, and particularly shifting to data mesh services. What we want to incentivize is in the department is if you're an initiative that produces data, the value of your initiative is do other programs and initiatives then consume that data? Do you create data as a product? That is not the way we typically measure output in the department, right? So getting those programs that are data producers to really measure their value by the degree that they're generating data products that are then leveraged across the enterprise, and using that as a metric by which we scale things, we invest in things, we promote things, is a cultural shift for the department, but I think will be more meaningful than simply saying data is valuable, which can sometimes create perverse incentives.
Yep, that makes total sense. I want to spend a good amount of time talking about Task Force Lima and the generative AI initiatives. Before we get there, though, I think this is a kind of a unique opportunity to talk about some of the lessons learned around responsible AI and ethical AI, and how the department's thinking about that, and how that's been informed from past experiences, and then also what the relationship looks like right now between, right coast national security application of this and the left coast. From where I sit, it feels like it's a lot warmer than it's been almost at any point over the last 5 or 10 years, and would be interested in knowing, what do you think, what factors have kind of, helped move it in a more constructive and positive direction, and how can we build on that?
Well, maybe I'll take the opportunity here, because we've got certainly, a very California West Coast audience, to just ask the question. Maybe I'm just honestly asking this for my own awareness. How many people in this room have worked on or supported defense or national security applications, either in industry or in government directly? Okay, I'm looking around the room. I'm seeing maybe 10%, which in my mind is still highly insufficient. And I probably won't use this time today to make the sales pitch for why you should do national security. There is a strong sales pitch I'd like to make there. But, I will take the opportunity to say the Department of Defense has not made it easy on the people in this room to work with us, right? That's been a real challenge, is how you even break into the Defense Department. If you've developed a product. I've worked in the venture ecosystem and been a part of several startups, and I know how hard it is. So we want to, when we think about generative AI, we want to change that model and figure out how we can bring people in a meaningful way. So, we've started up this task force Lima. For those that are not tracking it, this is the department's generative AI task force. It was announced by the Deputy Secretary last month. And one of the main challenges it's thinking about is how to increase, the number, technical sophistication, and scale of the types of institutions, whether they're commercial, industry, startups, or even academic or nonprofit, open source that are contributing to this space. So we put some things out there. I'll just highlight for this audience. By the way, my chief strategy officer is here somewhere, Jin Young England, who was the former director of the Defense Digital Service. For people that may be tracking that organization, they're one of the leading organizations bringing in highly technical talent to the government. She's transitioned into our organization as helping us develop the strategy to bring in companies. So Lima has a couple calls out there. It's through a mechanism called TradeWinds. You can Google it and see it out there, where we put out some calls for information around generative AI. And what we're trying to do is get to understand right now. I apologize, it may be monologue-y, so I'll just jump into several things at once. With generative AI, the assessment of the department is generative AI does not, on its face, meet the department's requirements for the implementation of responsible AI. So if I'm going to deploy an AI solution in the department, there's a decree you mentioned that came out about 2 years ago. It gives 5 principles that AI has to meet in order for it to be deployed in the DoD, and there are challenges with generative AI and meeting those principles. So what we're trying to do with our, right now, our Task Force Lima initiative is put out a call to experts in the community, and there's several categories of things we're thinking about, but how do we operationally test and evaluate the performance of these models? How do we understand the risks of these models? How do we understand new forms of risk that the department isn't acutely aware of and don't fit into our taxonomies? How do we improve human-machine teaming with interaction with these models? These are really foundational questions we're trying to address before we can really move deeply into the space of generative AI. At the same time, we want to create the actual environments to be able to do things down the line. So, how do we create the sandbox? How do we bring in the data? How do we bring in the infrastructure? And how do we make it easier for companies that have solutions that do meet those responsible AI remits to be able to deploy their solutions in the department? So those sort of twin pillars are the main focus of the Lima activities today.
That's interesting. I think something that as an industry everyone's been grappling with is around kind of the nature of generative AI, new architectures, compared to where we were a year or 24 months ago, where by and large we were using inference pipelines to populate knowledge graphs and then querying those knowledge graphs, and a high degree of precision that you could at least measure and predictability on that, versus some of the novel challenges but also opportunities presented by LLMs. How's the department thinking about challenges on the one hand on constraining and wrangling them for operational purposes, but then also the opportunities that they may unlock over the next decade to advance our strategic objectives?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. I mean, the Department of Defense is like a large ship moving in the ocean. It's very hard to pivot it quickly. And we've spent years trying to move the department's MLOps backbone in the direction of, we need to bring in more data, we need to label our data, we need to run these, traditional sort of MLOps approaches. Generative AI happens, and now overnight we've got kind of a new MLOps architecture that we see emerging in the large industry ventures and startups that are really prominent in the space. So making that transition in the department is extremely challenging, right? And tell people, hey, this initiative that we've really been just trying to get going with machine learning, and now we need to change fundamentally the way we do that work in the face of generative, is very difficult. And it's made more difficult by the very nature of the technology itself, which in the department introduces huge risks and there are huge limitations. I would imagine most of the audience here today is quite excited about generative, and I'm excited about generative, but I'm also highly concerned about generative. It is risky, and the assessment is it does not meet the DoD AI ethical principles today. I'm also concerned as an operator. One of our most important principles is the technology has to be reliable and traceable. And when you look at that, that means a couple of different things. It means, first of all, it needs to be optimized on explicit and well-defined use cases. Generative AI, particularly large language models, aren't naturally inclined to implementations that have well-defined use cases versus computer vision, for example, where we've been able to do that. And a lot of the work we've done in computer vision is architecting and integrating the technology in the context of a specific use case. Generative, the concern my boss has raised, who is an AI expert and has come into the department, is this is technology that's leaked from the lab. I'll tell you, as an operator, the tendency to interact with a large language model and believe that it possesses characteristics it does not possess is tempting. Right, we're not confident that there's appropriate education and understanding across the department of the limits of the technology when they utilize it. So when we think about building the infrastructure, one of the areas we really have to invest in is how are we going to, break through that hurdle?
Yep.
How are we going to invest in the use cases and understand those use cases and create an environment where the algorithmic output can be understood, can be tested. And I think the responsible AI principles create a great framework for us to look at generative AI because, I mean, what are they? There's a responsibility component, which means at the end of the day, a human being has to be accountable for the output of the AI. That's really what that means. We can't offset things. They have to be equitable, right? We have to make sure that when AI is implemented, it's we're understanding and minimizing the impacts of bias, which is a tremendous problem when we're dealing with generative AI, particularly large language models. I mentioned traceability, which I don't think I would have to argue to anybody here it's a particularly difficult limitation with generative AI, as well as reliability, which means the operator understands when they use it exactly what they're using and what its limitations are, that they're educated in those things. So those are all real challenges. And then governability, which is the extent that we're sitting on top of this and we're able to manage and monitor and understand algorithmic performance across a distributed and complex enterprise. So I think those ethical AI principles were well crafted and apply uniquely to the space of generative AI. And figuring out how we can make investments to move the technology forward. We're at a point where clearly the technology is meaningful, but the department hasn't fully grasped how to implement it in a way that both advances mission and adheres to responsible AI will be a significant challenge for us in the coming years. And that's why we've stood up the task force to focus on those problems.
Makes total sense. All right, hard pivot here onto hardware and infrastructure in particular. Unlike commercial companies, the Department of Defense and services must operate on classified networks with finite compute capabilities on often contested networks, or at least envision, interstate competition in the future where you'll have contested networks and need to push things as far to the edge as possible. How have those realities been shaping conversations around generative AI capabilities, in particular around just the enormous compute resources that are required in order just for inference on these?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. And I got to say, one of the advantages of being, that I'm not a self-professed expert in the technology, I'm an operator, and I'm thinking about mission output, is I get to talk to the experts.
Yeah.
And I love it when I talk to experts and none of them agree on anything. And because it alerts me to where there's, differences in the community. And I think this area of compute is one where we've heard everything from, hey, the department needs to drop everything, get every chip it can because it's going to need massive scale compute in order to do anything meaningful in the generative AI space, to that story is overtold. And in fact, there are amazing things you can do with investments in modern chips. And, frankly, the scale of compute is a manageable challenge if you're really thinking through in a critical way the types of problems you're trying to solve, the infrastructure you need to solve it, and you're willing to invest in that. So, we're trying to think through that, now a little bit. I will share that the department sentiment is, it is a challenge to get the infrastructure we need to do AI into our environments, right? And a lot of that is not a funding challenge. It's more of an accreditation challenge and a security challenge, right? And getting people to leverage that. So I think we're trying to think through that now. I think with Task Force Lima, you'll see in our call to industry we put out that closes here next week, one of the main questions we ask is do you have a framework or a tool to think about compute in terms of your ability, but not just to train, but to run the models? In the DoD, inference tends to be, I think, a higher compute cost as a percentage than you'd get in most enterprise applications because of our physical manifestation in multiple locations. And when we look at, a percentage cost spent in GPU in the DoD on edge and inference types of compute versus training compute, I think you'll see it's disproportionately weighted to the latter. And then the other question that we're dealing with, particularly with large language models, is what are we doing? Are we building large models? Are we fine-tuning models? Are we leveraging the models that are out there and figuring out how to implement them in mission? I mean, you can imagine the range of possibilities that are open to the department that we're exploring through Task Force Lima. Each of those questions then has tremendous flow through to infrastructure questions in terms of the investments we make as a department.
Yeah, I think it's difficult to pattern match historically against this kind of moment right now because you have players like OpenAI, Anthropic, Cohere, Mistral, and others that are producing incredibly performant large models. But then you also have like Clem and the team at Hugging Face and others, who are finding like smaller parameter models on narrower sets of tasks far more compute efficient and often are more performant, right? And I think the jury's out on which model is going to prevail, or if it's going to be kind of a tapestry kind of approach where you kind of plug and play different ones for different use cases depending on availability of compute and the workloads that you're putting on them.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the Defense Department, National Security Enterprise is one of the largest institutions. It will be a tapestry. And you can imagine there's a set of use cases where leveraging open models and running things on commercial infrastructure, paying for inference, or leveraging free inference will meet requirements, right?
Yep.
You can imagine there, by the way, there will be a number of use cases where this technology simply will not be adopted because of its inherent technical limitations mean that it cannot be applied in a way that meets the DoD's legal and ethical principles. And then there's a bunch in the middle, and that could mean fine-tuning models, it could mean building and so I think that's a largely undefined space we're working through right now. A large problem in the department is just our acquisition processes aren't really designed for this type of scaled consideration of the emergence of technology. We still buy software and AI like we buy aircraft carriers and planes and ships, and that is a huge challenge. I'll give a specific example of that, which is testing. When I talk about testing artificial intelligence solutions, typically the first place the department moves is how do I certify a solution as final and then deploy it and put it on sustainment, which is kind of the way you'd build a ship or a plane, right? I build it, I've got a spec, I deploy it, and now I've sustained it. That does not work with these technologies, right? Where you need to, programs that work on them need to have a constant strategy to invest in their data, to invest in their testing, to understand performance, to mitigate performance risks, to adopt and innovate on new sets of technologies. So the entire acquisition process around AI is a real challenge.
Yep.
That we need to work through in order to tackle the types of challenges that you've described.
Another thing, I know time's drawing short here, so maybe the last kind of question comment for you to kind of bounce off you here, Joe, is compared to 5 or 10 years ago, the open source ecosystem around machine learning is just incredibly vibrant. And, it's expansive. The number of tools, unstructured is one of them, but there's a lot of like LangChain, Llama Index. We heard from Harrison and Jerry yesterday. How is the department thinking about the availability of tooling in the open source domain with the necessity to sustain still and support over the longer term? How does it create opportunities for rapid prototyping, but also challenges in terms of productionization? And what could this community do better to kind of meet the needs of the warfighters?
I think we're making progress in this space. I know I may have sounded negative on the department before, and I'd like to promote an area where I think we're really making tremendous progress, which is exactly what you described. So one of the initiatives in our portfolio is one of the largest and most impactful data initiatives in the department called ADVANA, Advancing Data and Analytics, which is an initiative that's bringing together hundreds of department data sets. We use things like Snowflake and Databricks. We create a lakehouse. We run applications. When we watch the evolution of that particular initiative, one of the interesting things I've seen is that it's migrated over the last 5 years from hey, deploy me an application to I want a builder environment in order to do my own work, and I want you to accredit the tool sets so I can really do custom DevOps work. And that's where we need to move, particularly in the AI space. Obviously, the DoD has concerns about open source software and how it's implemented in our enterprise, but we recognize in order to maintain technological parity with industry and move the department forward, we have to figure out this problem and get comfortable with it. And I think we're moving forward with that in our enterprise.
Open, interoperable microservices that sit on kind of a shared foundation is what I'm hearing.
Absolutely, yes.
Gotcha. Any final comments that you'd like to make more broadly about trade wins, about Alpha One, about scaffolding, and any other initiatives that CDAO is undertaking?
Yeah, I'll just make the pitch to the audience. If you're an industry participant and you want to work with the department, please check out TradeWinds. It's our, we, by the way, use other transaction authorities and more modern acquisition practices to bring people on. So we put out some calls that you can see if you Google Task Force Lima and TradeWinds. They're out there. We've established a website through the Defense Digital Service. That is the way to interact with Task Force Lima, dds.mil. You'll see that link on there, and we're working on now a Task Force Lima website that'll allow you to interact. And then the last piece is in CDAO. This one's probably a pitch. I don't know that'll go anywhere, but I'll make it. We're opening a new branch focused on digital talent management that's really trying to access and bring in digital talent to help run the department initiative. So if you're a researcher, or university student, or even in industry, and you're less interested in working with the DoD through your corporate capacity and actually directly contributing, we're making big moves on that in 24. I may be out of a job come Monday if we're furloughed, but for a little bit. But when we're back online, we're going to be moving on that. And we're really trying to build a world-class place for people coming from industry to work and move outside of the traditional DoD bureaucracy that I think a lot of people are reticent to engage in to work in government. So I'd ask for people to get involved. It's called the Digital Talent Management Initiative at CDAO. So,
awesome.
Thank you.
Awesome. Well, thank you very much, Joe. Everyone, please join me in giving Joe a round of applause there.